Welcome to the Frontline virtual event. Tonight we're going to talk about Rwanda, and we're going to talk about a particular book, which is this book which I have here by the writer Michela Wrong, and it's called Do Not Disturb, the story of a political murder and an African regime gone bad. Now that title in itself is quite provocative. I have an excellent panel here, including Michela. But before I introduce them, I just wanted to talk very briefly about Rwanda. Many of you here will be familiar with Rwanda. Many of you may be from Rwanda or from neighboring countries. And I think that for all of us, what we associate Rwanda with more than anything else is the genocide in 1994, that absolutely appalling event that happened. I have a particular interest in that because I was there. I was the only English-speaking journalist in Kigali as the genocide started. So I don't often do events on Rwanda because I don't normally like to think about it, but I thought that this was a really important one. And I think that that genocide really, it put Rwanda on the map in all the wrong ways. And much has been written about it, about the Hutu power movement, which set about trying to wipe out the Tutsi minority. And those of us who were there, Rwandans and non-Rwandans, that was the central and terrible event in our lives. And one of the things that we will all remember is the Rwandese Patriotic Front, who came down from the north. This was an army mainly of Tutsis, and they did put an end to that genocide. And then President Paul Kagame was installed in power. And I, like many others, got to know many of those senior members of the RPF. But in the years that have gone by since then, we're talking about more than a quarter of a century, much has changed. And many of those people who we got to know are no longer in power. Paul Kagame is there, but many of the people we got to know are in prison or they're in exile, and some of them have been assassinated. And that's where this book comes in. And Kagame himself has become a very important figure on the international stage, very much supported by people like former Prime Minister Tony Blair, former President Bill Clinton, many people still in the British Parliament who see him as the savior of the country. But this book questions that narrative, and that's why it's so provocative, and that's also why it's so important. So with us to discuss this tonight, we have Michela Wrong, who is the author of that book. We have Veronica Shandari. Now, Veronica's father, Frank Rusagara, was one of those men who we all met in those early days. But Frank Rusagara is now in prison in Kigali, and Veronica will be talking about that. And we have Eleneus Akanga, who was a journalist in Kigali and is now living in this country in exile and is a human rights advocate and still a journalist as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around one by one and ask people just to sort of lay out their stall, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion between us, and then I'll open for questions. Now, this is being recorded, and it will also be available online. I welcome your questions. One thing I will say about the questions is please engage with the arguments. This book needs to be challenged, it needs to be discussed, but what we don't need is attacks on either Michela as the writer or any of the other panelists as individuals. We don't need attacks on people, but what we do need is discussion, and very spirited discussion about the arguments, because the arguments are not, this is not history which is agreed. This is history which is contested, and that's why tonight is so important. Michela, let me turn to you first. This is a controversial book. You're setting out something that many people don't agree with. Tell me where this came from and what your motivation is and your central thesis.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thanks for that really good introduction. The book would not exist had it not been for something that happened in a room at the Michelangelo Hotel, New Year 2013, when Patrick Karegeya, the former head of intelligence of Rwanda, who had gone into exile in South Africa, where he had set up an opposition party and denounced his former boss, Paul Kagame, was invited up to the room by a friend, a businessman friend called Apollo. And the following day, his body was found in that room by his nephew and the police breaking into the room. And he'd been strangled there by a commando almost certainly sent by from Kigali by Paul Kagame. I think there are quite a lot of journalists keying in today, listening to this broadcast, who will have known Patrick Kagame. I'm sure you did as well, because he was head of external intelligence in Rwanda in his prime, but he was also the man who dealt with the press, and he made the press welcome. And he was, in a way, the most coherent and persuasive apologist and explainer of this narrative that you've been describing, of the RPF coming in from Uganda, ending the genocide, dealing with this absolutely devastated country, preaching reconciliation and rebuilding, from the ashes. And he argued that very, very forcefully. So what struck me when he was strangled was, this is an amazing, trajectory this man has followed, and he's not the only one, not the only one in that elite, and it would be very important to tell the story of how he had ended up strangled, on the orders from his old best friend, his schoolmate and former rebel comrade in that hotel room. So I did a lot of research in Uganda, wrote a lot, went and interviewed people who had known all these young men, these young Tutsis who had grown up in Uganda, dreaming of the day when they would return home. Some of them were refugees living in refugee camps where they'd been expelled in the 1950s. Some of them were indigenous Kenya, Rwanda speaking Ugandans. And just, to me, the book is about that trajectory of how this very united rebel movement ends up with some of its members on the run, in exile, denouncing Paul Kagame, and Paul Kagame sending killers out to get them. And while I was researching it, what I realized, and it was a lot of it was already in the press, was that there were so many other people who had been targeted: Rwandan journalists, Rwandan human rights activists, Rwandan judges who had disappeared, fled, gone into exile, been intimidated, been beaten up, been renditioned, and in the worst cases assassinated, and that nobody seemed to want to know about this story in the Western community, that there was this complicit silence because everyone was so convinced by this narrative that Patrick Kagame, amongst many others, had sold to the world. So that's the story of the book. And it involved, I was knowingly talking to a bunch of aggrieved, jaundiced, upset dissidents, because it seemed to me that we've heard the other side of the story. We've heard for 27 years how marvelous Kagame is, what amazing development, achievements he's ticked off his list, what an economic miracle Rwanda is. And firstly, I thought some of those statistics really were not that credible, but also, there was something else going on, something much darker, more sinister going on underneath. So it's definitely, the story is seen from a group of whistleblowers, but whistleblowers with extraordinary access. So that's basically what the book's about.
Thank you, Michela. Veronica, let me come to you, because your father was one of those people who was in the forefront of the RPF in 1994, and he rose very high in the government, and yet he is now in a prison cell in Kigali. Tell me how that happened. Veronica, we're waiting for you, and I hope that you're not muted. I'm not seeing you coming up. Yeah, Veronica, tell us what happened to your father.
So I usually talk about my father and uncle's case because they're both intertwined and the charges are the same. And my uncle is my maternal side, brother to my mother. They're both military men who started in the rebel group in Uganda. That's where they started their journey from. Then made their way to Rwanda. Dad rose to Brigadier General. And some of the roles he held was Secretary General, Ministry of Defense, military historian, and lastly, Defense Attaché to the UK. And Uncle Tom was personal bodyguard to the president and head of the Republican Guard in charge of leading security for the president. They were both arrested in August 2014 They both have similar charges that they were inciting insurrection among the population and tarnishing the image of the country and government. They were tried in Kanombe military court, though Dad had been discharged from the military in 2013. So essentially wasn't supposed to be there. They were convicted March 2016 and sentenced to 20 and 21 years, respectively. 2017, a UN working group on arbitrary detention found their detention in violation of international law and called for their immediate release, but to no avail, no response from the Rwandan government on that. 2019, they appealed to the Supreme Court in Rwanda, still no avail. They reduced their sentence to 15 years without including the 5 years. So essentially, it's like their sentence is still the same. They're going to spend 20 years in prison. And then the other bit that's come up now is in 2020, they're taking their case to the East African Court of Justice. And with this new application, they decide to bring up a new charge to Uncle Tom's case, that he has a criminal case that he tried to escape from prison. The surprising bit is that they're both in solitary confinement. So I don't know how you try to escape when you're in solitary confinement. And yeah, so that's where the case is right now.
So Veronica, these charges have been laid and it's been put before a court. I take it that you don't think that these charges are real. What do you think is the real reason that your father and your uncle are in prison?
So mainly Dad has always been a person who criticizes. He's always been somebody who spoke his mind, didn't have an issue telling you what he really felt. So essentially that's what they're in court for, that they're criticizing. But the main thing as well is that the people who appeared in court were usually hearsay or conversations held in private, and that's usually a non-issue. Who goes up in court to talk about people's conversations in private? So it also showed the level at which that the government is intruding into people's personal lives. So nobody has, what would I call it? Nobody has a personal life per se in Rwanda. Everywhere you're being watched, everybody, even in your own home, in bars, in social settings.
So these are conversations which your father had where he was critical of Paul Kagame, and yet this came up in court, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Let me move on to Eleneus Akanga. So, Eleneus, you were, as far as I know, very successful journalist on the New Times, which is an important newspaper in Rwanda, and now you're in exile in the UK. If you could just very briefly tell us what meant that you decided you couldn't stay in Rwanda any longer.
Yeah, thank you. I was a journalist for the New Times, which obviously is a pro-government newspaper, an English daily now, that writes and comments in English. And sometime in 2007, I wrote a story about journalist beatings. And this was a story about beatings that were going on in the country, specifically targeting journalists that had been critical of the government. So,
I'm hearing quite a lot of noises off, but I think
yes,
carry on, Eleneus.
I'm not sure, I can hear lots of noises as well, but I'll continue.
Carry on anyway.
Yes. So I wrote this story about these journalists that were being beaten. And as it turned out, the government denied that the government was beating these journalists, although the journalists seemed to think that they were being beaten because of their work. They accused me of tarnishing the country's image, and subsequently I was forced to leave the New Times as a journalist. I went out and I couldn't find a job. So together with my friends, we decided to set up a newspaper, an independent newspaper, which we did set up, the Weekly Post. When the Weekly Post first published its maiden issue, the government came hard and fast on us. in charging us and alleging that we were getting support and were being funded by negative forces, specifically by the Ugandan government, to tarnish the country's image. I was accused of being a Ugandan spy, and alongside my friends with whom we had set up this newspaper, and things became so tight. They wanted to have me jailed for espionage because they had concocted all these stories of how we were being funded. But basically what it was a case, a typical case of the Rwandan government at the time, and even so now, of silencing dissent. They never really wanted an independent newspaper being set up. So they wanted to find ways of silencing us, and espionage or these flimsy allegations of sabotage, of working with negative forces, the same as in Veronica's case, in Veronica's father's case. They charged us with that, and they closed our newspaper, and they were planning on arresting me for espionage. And that is when I managed to flee with the help of some of my friends in this country, actually, and flee to the UK, where I sought asylum, and was granted that in 2007. And I've lived here since.
Okay, thank you. So let me come to, what I'm going to do now is, because I want to ask you a few questions, because there have been criticisms of your book. So I want to put some of those criticisms to you. I'm already getting some questions coming up, but and we will deal with those in a minute. One of the first things is you start off talking about Rwandan culture, and you talk about it as a culture really of deceit, and you talk about lying. Now, this as lying as part of Rwandan culture. Now, this has been criticized partly because you quote a hoary old colonialist called Ewart Grogan, and it is a generalization. Why did you start with that? Why did you think that was the right thing to start with?
It is a generalization, but I've always thought it's very important how cultures think of themselves and how they talk about themselves when they're talking to foreigners, foreign journalists in particular, because that's the way they define themselves. And what I had discovered when I was researching the book, and you know, anyone who's covered Rwanda will be very familiar with it, is that so many of the people I was talking to, and many of them were prime ministers or ex-government ministers, they would sort of say, you've got to watch it because everyone's going to lie to you. This is what we do. We enjoy misleading outsiders. We're a very discreet, very private culture. We keep our secrets very close to our chest. And I felt I had to confront that head on and talk about this kind of characteristic. What I think other Rwandans have described as this culture of doublespeak, that you say one thing to outsiders and you know something within your own culture, but you say something very different when you're talking to outsiders. Because so many of my key witnesses in this book were top-ranking officials, people like Patrick Karegeya or General Kayumba Nyamwasa, who is also in exile and has had various attempts made on his life in South Africa, who used to say certain things to the press. Theogene Rudasingwa, another exiled official, very high up official who's in exile. And they used to say certain things, and they had this version of history and this narrative of what the RPF had done, and very noble kind of story was being told. And then all these years later, they're telling you something completely different. So the challenge—
Doesn't that make them an unreliable witness if they tell you one thing to begin with and another thing later?
But I think as a writer, you have to be honest about that and say, this is the challenge. And that's what I was saying in the intro. This is the challenge. You're dealing with a culture where people will keep telling you, we like to take people like you for a ride. And you're dealing with people who've sort of changed their story. How do you try and work out what's true in those circumstances? So I think that that whole sort of introduction has been rather oversimplified. I mean, for me, the answer boils down to, you have to re-interview people, keep interviewing them. You have to compare what they say now to what they said before. You have to compare what they say to what the facts on the ground are the key thing, if you can establish what they are, and you just have to keep asking questions all the time. But I think it was very important to inject a note of doubt, because something that really annoys me reading books about Rwanda is this absolute certainty with which outsiders are often commenting on events. Because this is, of course, an incredibly emotive story, because so many people died and people are absolutely adamant in their views. And you sort of think, but you are dealing with people who've changed their story, and you have to sort of then learn and decide how you're going to maneuver around that fact. So that's why.
Can I come back to Eleneus on that? So Eleneus, well, what do you feel about this characterization of what is your culture? You know, that is, it is a culture where they say one thing to each other is a different thing to outsiders, a culture of deception. Is that, do you recognize that?
No, I think the point here is that anyone, let alone any Rwandan who is accusing Michela of lying when he says that Rwandans are natural born liars is either missing the point or just being disingenuous. The point here, I think, is not that Michela, of course, it's an anathema to just think that the whole nation, a whole group of people could be liars. And I don't think that is the point that Michela is making in her book. I think the question here is it more likely that a Rwandan will tell you a lie or the truth? And the answer to that is that a Rwandan will most likely tell you a lie, because if it fits the narrative that he's trying to sell to you. We lie to exist. I mean, we've become a nation that kind of a people that kind of are afraid of saying what we think because of the intimidation that we've had as a nation. People are not, they don't have the right to say what they have to say. I mean, you've heard of Veronica's dad's story where someone expresses an opinion and then they just a private opinion in a private capacity, and they fall for that. So we lie because we are a reserved sort of people. So people, they will not say anything to you unless they are absolutely sure that you won't sell them on, especially so if it's a foreigner. So we lie to exist, we lie to get jobs, we lie to even stay in jobs, we lie to get favors. So it's what we do.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there and move on to other issues. Michela, one of the other important issues is how the international community has treated Rwanda, and this is where your version is different from other versions. I mean, the narrative is that Rwanda has done incredibly well since, I mean, the devastating genocide, and then the economy has improved, and Kagame, yes, okay, he's a strong man. Yes, he gets 97% in elections, but he effectively makes the trains run on time. I mean, Rwanda is indisputably better in the last 25 years than it was before. That's the narrative. Why do you challenge that?
I think a lot of the statistics are being challenged now by economists and statisticians who are experts in the field, and they do so with huge wariness and huge nervousness, because there is this established consensus in the development world that Rwanda is a shining example of successful development aid. And I think that has taken hold, that it's become this kind of, because the West has been so desperate to see success stories, especially in Africa, that show that foreign aid, if intelligently applied, will work, that it has become really, really hard for people in that industry, the development industry, to accept that actually maybe it's not so brilliant after all. And I think what I find very, what makes me very uneasy about the Rwanda story, and sort of gets my neck starts to prickle, is the way in which development statistics are used to justify and excuse repression. So you get this sort of conversations with officials in the aid world, where basically they seem to be signing off on extremely, egregious violations of human rights, obviously rigged elections, a totally sycophantic and supine press, the intimidation of all opposition forces so that they mostly leave the country, and all the journalists have left, all the independent journalists like Eleneus have left. And that's sort of okay because, Rwanda's delivering on maternal mortality and primary school education. And you sort of think, so is this really what sort of taxpayers in the West want their tax money to be spent on. This is a very topical subject as aid is coming up to, for discussion in the British Parliament. But you sort of think, I think there's this real danger where the development world tends to think that authoritarianism delivers development like no other regime, and I really have a problem with that. And I think most of us should reject that.
Okay. Veronica, let me come to you. I know that you've read Michela's book, and obviously one of the main issues it's talking about is the targeting through imprisonment or, even assassination of people like your father who were once at the top table in the RPF. Tell me, what did you make of the book, and how do you think it relates to your father and your uncle's story?
I think one of the things I picked up was on the lie that has been told so very much, and now it's unable to be broken. And that seems to be very much the thing that the RPF put forefront. We were saviors. We're now the miracle country with development, but at the core issue of it, there's all sorts of human rights violations going on. And so in correlation with that and what Michela wrote, it was kind of that bit of putting 2 and 2 together of like, so there's all this going on, but also where it started from. Because sometimes you try to imagine these people who are supposedly refugees, who've gone through all sorts of hardship. I don't think that's the thing that's at the forefront for them to come and impose on people they've come to, per se, save or join and be a new nation, per se. And then you come and find that all these modes of systems that that are in place actually started from Uganda, like that whole bit of Agafuni.
What's Agafuni? People don't know what Agafuni is.
So Agafuni is the way how they used to kill people. It's, I don't know, they strike me on the back of your head.
And you're saying that this happened back when the RPF was in Uganda. So you're saying that some of this cruelty and so on is not something that developed over time, but you're saying that it was always there. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it was always there. There's always been those stories of people being killed, and even wherever that the RPF traveled, there were always people being killed along their pathway.
So let me stop you there, because we've got a question here from somebody called Glenn Ruger, and it's quite interesting. He says, if the post-war narrative is being challenged and turned on its head, is there any reason to question the narrative of the war itself? Which I think is a very key question. I don't think anybody is challenging that there was a genocide. I mean, all of us who were there, we know that, and I know that Michela knows that because she was there, and I certainly know that. So I don't think anybody is challenging a genocide. That is not the point. But there are things in the narrative which, Michela, you are challenging, and not least is the issue of who shot down the plane carrying the presidents of Burundi and Rwanda on the 6th of April 1994, that night. I heard it when it was coming down. I heard the explosion. And Patrick Karagaya, well, tell us what Patrick Karagaya said about it.
I don't go into it in huge detail because it's an issue that has been exhaustively written about by many other people long before I got around to writing this book. But I've read, there have been a series of reports, done in Belgium, France, Rwanda itself, Spain. I mean, there's been endless reports, investigations into the downing of the plane, because of course the plane's downing triggered the start of the genocide with all these roadblocks where Tutsis were being slaughtered by Hutu extremists, and that's when it all began. Like many journalists, I'd read the one book that one could get at that stage, Gérard Prunier's History of Rwanda, and he believed that what he, I think, was told by the RPF, that it was Hutu extremists who wanted to take Habyarimana out because he had been making too many concessions at the peace talks he'd been having with the RPF. It seemed to me always a little of a curious story, because they would have slaughtered their own champion, but the idea was that they felt he had sold them out and they needed a sacrificial victim, and I went into writing this book with very much an open mind, and was really quite sort of taken aback because so many of the people I interview in this book are former, senior officials in the RPF. People like General Kayumba Nyamwasa, who obviously was a key military commander when the RPF was on the outskirts of Kigali, about to come in. Patrick Karegeya, who became the head of external intelligence, and various other key members. And they were all they all said, but of course we did it. I mean, of course we did, why would you think anything different? And I think a lot of journalists who were based in Nairobi sort of after the genocide used to have those kind of conversations, but never felt that they could say anything because it was impossible to prove. And really what you get is a series of reports which have all reached different conclusions. And in my view, shed more heat than light, because a lot of them are based on evidence about, areas of zones de tir, as they say in French, and missile numbers, serial numbers on the missiles, where people think the trajectory of the missiles, eyewitnesses was. I mean, you've been in many more war zones than I have, but whenever I've been anywhere near live fire, I've always found it absolutely impossible to tell where anything was being shot from, because the sound is all you hear and you have no idea where it's coming from. So I've always been a little wary of the idea that you could establish where those missiles were fired on the basis of eyewitness testimony. When I heard one former senior RPF official after another saying, of course we did it, what else, why wouldn't it be us? And the fact that no one on the side of the Hutu extremists, the FDLR, has ever said it was us, I tended to think, yeah, well, these whistleblowers, Ali was talking earlier about, who lies and why you lie. And I think for me, someone who's in a senior position of power in Rwanda, and whose job depends on staying on the right side of Paul Kagame, and has several villas and assets and maybe runs a business there, and his kids are in university, they've got a good reason not to expose an embarrassing truth. By the time they've left the country, had several attempts on their lives made, have lost all their assets because they've been confiscated by the state, have been, vilified and besmirched in public 1 million times, and had, legal charges pressed against them, I tend to think they are more likely to be honest at that stage. So this for me is one of this discussion about who do you believe and when do you believe them. So when they started saying to me, we did it, of course we did it, I sort of thought, yeah, I guess you probably did,
But this is all a very complicated thing, because we're talking about, it's a sort of moral as well as a political issue, because I mean, many of us did admire Kagame, Kayumba Karegeya, the people who did come down and they did put an end to the genocide, and also Veronica's father. So Eleneus, this is complicated for you, isn't it? I mean, you and I were talking yesterday, and you were saying, that Veronica's father, Frank Rusagara, was a hero to you.
He is, and he still remains a hero to me. Just so like many other officers that served within the RPA and the RPF that have ended up either in jail or even dead. I mean, in some sad circumstances. I first met Veronica's dad actually as a young reporter after I just started. I think it was in 2005 or 2005. I think 2005. Yeah, and he was at the time, he was the commandant of the Rwandan Military Academy in Nyakinama. I mean, there was a training there, and he was the commandant of the academy. And I spoke to him after, because I had to give him an interview. There was a training about some officers that had come from Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. And he struck me as a man who actually understood what statecraft meant. I mean, he is a land person. He's a very intelligent fella, and he knew what was going on, and he was always willing to speak out. And the trouble I think that we've had in Rwanda, especially with Paul Kagame, is that the RPF, which was this, this patriotic front party that came to stop the genocide, was made up for good intentions, And people actually joined the RPF with good intentions because they saw it as a party that just stood for something that they believed in. The problem, I think, came once they went into Rwanda, after they just came into Rwanda, that Paul Kagame then decided that this RPF, both the party and the army, he kind of decided to just take over. And I think that's where the problem started. I mean,
okay,
people
I'm
have to
stop you. I'm going to stop you there because I think that's a very key point,
yes.
which is that and when you read the book, a lot of it does come back to Paul Kagame himself and his character and his authoritarian instincts, if I can put it like that. So before I come to you, Michela, to tell us a bit more about what you wrote about Kagame in the book, let me come back to Veronica and just ask you, Veronica, what do you think about Paul Kagame and how has your view on Paul Kagame changed over the years? I mean, I presume you know him. I presume you must have met him when you were a little girl.
Yeah, I've met him, and in my young years, I went to the same school as his children. Yeah, for about 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
But to me now, it's kind of become the whole thing of he is equated to the country and the government. So when you criticize the government issues or the country, it is like you are criticizing him personally. Or if you're criticizing him, you are criticizing Rwanda or the government in place. So it's a very weird, I don't know, anomaly.
Yeah, so he's totally, so he's, what you're saying is he is totally associated with the government, with the state, with the country. It's like a one-man rule.
Yeah,
is that what you're saying?
One-man show. Essentially, that's just a one-man show. That's exactly what's happening in Rwanda. So it also kind of looks, the image is very important. So and that's very strange that also part of Eleneus's charges was part of tarnishing the image. And tarnishing the image is because you've criticized Kagame, all the policies that are in place, and it's a whole different entity. So half the time you're wondering, what do the two have to do with each other?
Okay, let me come back to so Michela. Well, I mean, you describe you have a lot of detail and a lot of evidence about assassinations, attempted assassinations, and so on. To what extent do you ascribe this to Kagame personally? And to what extent do you describe it as, well, it's just, it's an authoritarian system with secret police, and we've seen this in many different countries?
I think we have seen this in many countries. I mean, for example, one of my books is about Eritrea, and you could say something very similar has happened there, where you have a former revolutionary movement full of, band of brothers, essentially, who fought in the bush together, shared the trenches, shared their meager rations, bonded in incredibly intense ways. And then as soon as they get into power, one man begins to emerge supreme. And eventually in Eritrea, what happened is the G15, as they're known, who were all his closest comrades, end up in jail. They've never been seen since 2000. So it's definitely a syndrome with former revolutionary movements. But I think that, what I felt writing this book was a very personalized book, but I don't make any apologies for that, because I really felt that the history of the Great Lakes, Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, and Congo, has been so dictated by the personalities. The personal has been the political. And, so for example, in Rwanda, you've got the charismatic figure of Fred Rusagara, who was Paul Kagame's old friend, who was the charismatic military leader of the RPF and led the troops across the border in 1990 and was killed on the second day of the invasion. And pretty much every man, senior RPF guy that I've ever spoken to will say, had Fred survived, had he lived, Rwanda today would be totally different. The RPF would have been totally different, and Rwanda.
I mean, it does help to be dead, doesn't it? If you want to become.
It does. There's a James Dean.
The myth of Saint Fred is there.
It's definitely, he's acquired martyr status, But I think there is a feeling, what that betrays, that whole story, is that there's a feeling that Kagame's failings, his, he is a man with deep sort of a sense of grievance, who feels he grew up in a refugee camp, had it very, very tough, had a huge inferiority complex towards many of the commanders who he's now sort of alienated and marginalized, very suspicious, never trusted anyone around him. So his way was always to preempt possible coup attempts by sending someone off to be an ambassador to China, sending them off to be an ambassador to India, sacking them, marginalizing them, and eventually sending killers out to take them. And he will often do that before they actually become a threat. And I think one of the great tragedies of Paul Kagame's modus operandi, as far as I can see, is that he's often created serious threats to his regime by anticipating that they will emerge. So instead of sort of allowing these dissidents, these sort of embittered, upset, sacked officials to just leave, go abroad, run their farms, set up businesses and slowly retire, he's always assumed that they would set up significant opposition movements, militias, and then he sends people out to take them out. And surprise, surprise, he turns these men who were probably stunned by the misadventure that had befallen them, and they're just sort of trying to work out how they're going to make a living, he turns them into mortal enemies. So I think that's one of the great sort of ironies of his regime.
What is the evidence that you quote that he is in any way responsible for example, the central issue, the killing of Patrick Kagame?
Well, I covered the inquest in South Africa, and it's an inquest that I notice the Rwandan intelligence does a lot of tweeting, usually to try and discredit anyone who criticizes it, including me. And they will always skim over the evidence that was revealed during the inquest into Patrick Kagame's death in South Africa. And they'll say, oh, the inquest was struck from the rolls, which is complete nonsense. The inquest could never go as far as a trial because it led to 2 arrest warrants being issued for Apollo, this businessman who had lured Patrick Kagame to the room in that hotel, and for Alex Sugira, who was one of the killers. And those 2 men, that extradition requests have been issued for them. They've never been sent back. But so firstly, Rwanda is not cooperating and not sending 2 suspected killers back to South Africa. But the other thing is, during the course of that inquest, some marvelous correspondence was revealed and read out to the court and made public, in which the South African Hawks, who are the elite force, who had investigated Patrick Kagame's death and also the attacks on Kayumba Nyamwasa, the general, who had ended up in hospital with a bullet in his back but survived during another attack. And they were saying, we know that the Rwandan government is directly involved. And they told the Security Committee of the South African Parliament this. They said, we know the Rwandan government is responsible for this, so we can't go any further. And all of this was revealed in court. So it's on the record, for me, that's...
Yeah, there was something that Kagame said, and I've been flicking through my notes and I can't find it. There was something Kagame said. What did he say about Kagame?
He was asked about Kagame several times, and at one stage, I think it was to the Wall Street Journal correspondent, he said, we didn't do it, but I wish we had. And yes, this is very typical of Kagame, that he will often say one thing in Kinyarwanda and another in English. He was constantly giving speeches at around that time in public, at prayer breakfast usually, where he would say, you may run, but you cannot hide. We will find you. Wherever you go, we will find you. But at the same time as he was saying that, and it was very obviously a commentary on Patrick Kagame's murder, he was also saying to Western journalists, oh no, of course we didn't do it, but I wish we had.
Okay, let me come to you, Eleneus. We're getting some questions in. We've got Johan Spunnen here asking whether the UK and the Commonwealth are becoming more critical about human rights violations in Rwanda now. And of course, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, Chogan, was supposed to be held in Kigali this month, I think, but because of COVID, it's not happening. Eleneus, are you seeing any change in attitudes to Rwanda because of these kind of issues, because of human rights abuses?
Yes, I think the campaign has always been there to kind of put forward the atrocities of Paul Kagame and his government and his inner circle. Because, I mean, we have to also distance the government from Paul Kagame. I mean, there are people within that government that probably are good souls who are trying to do it best. But then Paul Kagame, being the man that he is, a man who will kill anybody who just goes around against him, a man who will kill his own former chief of staff or that are killing for his own former chief of staff, will not do anything. So there has been a campaign to say to the world, look, this man might give you these impressive economic statistics that you really need because you've been giving aid to countries that have been wasting it, and this guy would give you the statistics to use for your taxpayers. But this guy is also evil. I mean, this is a man who is not afraid to take out anyone who opposes him, and who is not afraid to even go around and brag about it. So there has been a campaign, but also I must also say that the work of these established writers like Michela here or Judy River, Prunier, and all these other people that have done some fantastic work and some fantastic writing on to show what is happening in Rwanda are beginning to change the story. I mean, we all remember when the BBC published, broadcast this this documentary that kind of questioned the story around the genocide and what happened.
But there's a complexity, Eleneus, in there, because some of that stuff does shade into genocide denial. And it seems to me that it's really important that there should be a distinction between genocide denial, which is, in my view, unspeakable, and a legitimate investigation and criticism of the RPF.
Yes, I think there has to be that distinction, except, of course, in Paul Kagame's mind, because this is a guy who, as a military man, believes in discipline. You cannot criticize him. He's who cannot be criticized. So every time someone tries to critique or question the narrative, the story, which is this very, very tight story that they've kind of put up for all these 27 years, he gets very edgy. And for that, he either revokes the license of the BBC, or will take out somebody who is actually trying to do something, or will jail, I mean, we talk about Patrick, we talk about all these RPF officers that actually have fallen out with Paul Kagame and have been killed, but there have also been other people on the other side, the Hutus, who actually served within the RPF, and ended up, in some cases being killed, like the likes of Shongas, being jailed.
I mean, just to explain to people, really the first assassination of somebody from within a famous person from within the RPF, as it were, after the genocide, was Seth Sendashonga, who was the most senior Hutu within the RPF, who was killed in Nairobi. Veronica, can I come to you and ask, what do you want at this point? Your father, your uncle are still in prison, and we're seeing a bit of a change in international attitudes to the Rwandan government. What do you want from, for example, the British government, the US government, and so on?
They've danced around the Rwandan issue for quite a bit, because the number of lives lost is just indescribable. So yeah, much tougher, I guess. But they've also, I think they petitioned for certain sanctions on Rwanda. I'm not too sure. The Lantos Foundation put in to be applied on Rwanda. So I guess maybe that's a change.
Yeah.
And hopefully, because with just Rusagara's case already last year, they're going much further and worse in terms of the way they're operating. If they can go to a country in the middle of COVID, when the whole world is all shut down, and go and kidnap somebody, it's going
You're talking about Paul Rusagara here, who was the hero of Hotel Rwanda, who was well, I will use Kagame's own words. Kagame said that he wasn't forced onto a plane, he was hoodwinked or tricked onto a plane. That was what Kagame himself said, and taken back to Kigali, where he is now facing trial. Eleneus, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I was just going to say, there's also this element of people for so long, they had been Kagame might use the word hoodwinked, but he's also been hoodwinking the international community into believing that he's the exceptional man. And I think for some, they are beginning to see the light. They're beginning to see him for who he is. I mean, and these things are changing. I mean, we also have to recognize that he is a very smart man. So the first thing he dealt with was to deal with the idea. You know, he's always played on this genocide guilt. The international community never helped when they should have helped. And so you can't criticize me. Yes. Yes.
In fact, I'm just going to cut you off because we have a Nicola Harford here who's come up, and she says, can some blame for the lack of robust questioning of Rwanda's human rights violations be laid at the feet of high-profile politicians like Claire Short and Tony Blair, who championed the Rwandan cause in part to assuage the collective guilt felt by the UK for failing to stop the genocide? So, Michela, can I come to you, because we saw something interesting last week, which was President Macron of France and Kagame kissing and making up. That's a bit odd, isn't it? They spoke.
Yeah, I think Paul Kagame is supremely skilled at sort of finding new friends when his old friends look like they're tiring of him. And I think we've been getting, you're right, Nicola is right, there was a whole generation and a whole period in which people like Tony Blair and Claire Short, and then of course Andrew Mitchell after her, were so admiring. They were so ready to accept this narrative, and they were so admiring of the development performance that they really kind of, you know, sort of turned rather a very blind eye to all the human rights issues that were being raised. And now instead, I think I agree with Eleneus. I think the attitude of the US and UK has been changing. They've been voicing a lot more concern. There was a UN human rights peer review in Geneva back in February, I think, where they were making very robust criticisms. Kagame and Rwanda have not been included in a round of key meetings that Joe Biden has had coming in. Joe Biden, as we saw here in the UK just today or yesterday, is now making a big deal about democracy, and you know, we're back on scene and we care about these things again. Trump obviously didn't. So Kagame very cannily has found this new friend, and that's Emmanuel Macron, who wants to heal past wounds. And it's true that France has a lot of ground to make up for its role supporting Habyarimana and helping the génocidaires to flee the country in 1994. But it does suit Kagame very well that suddenly he's got this new friend. So I see that as a very cynical piece of realpolitik by France, but above all by Kagame, who is sort of jumped into a new relationship, just as his old lovers were showing signs of becoming weary.
And what about the Chinese? In fact, there were some questions quite early on. A couple of people here, you know who you are, Peter Humphrey and Monty McCurchie, were asking about China's relationship with the Rwandan government and so on. I mean, China is such a big force on the continent these days, and on the whole, they don't really care terribly much about people's fathers being in prison and so on. Do you see them supporting Kagame?
Well, I think they'll support whichever man is running the country, because they're after essential commodities, the mineral resources, many of which don't actually come from Rwanda. We know that they are actually being mined in neighboring DRC and sort of smuggled across the frontier and sold as Rwandan products, and that's been going on now for decades. So I think the Chinese are very happy to just sort of soak up all that product and not ask too many questions about where it comes from. But in terms of overt political alliances, I'm not so sure about that.
Veronica, let me come to you to come back on the sort of more personal side. But how is your father? Do you know? Are you able to be in touch with him or with your uncle at all?
No, we've never been in touch with Dad ever since he went to prison. They've been in solitary confinement since the beginning of their sentencing. And the last time anybody has seen Dad was when COVID struck, so around March 2020. So, at all.
Do you have any idea about the conditions under which he's being held?
Mainly just the whole solitary confinement, and
how do you think your father will cope with that? Will be coping with solitary confinement?
No, Dad they've both had quite some personal hardships. So with those under solitary confinement, I only imagine you deteriorate. Mom passed away when dad was in prison. They were never able to say goodbye to each other. And then also during, probably in 2019, he had an enlarged prostate, still no access to medical help. And Uncle Tom has always had a problem with his back. He has metal discs. And yeah, so still, even with him, no veil to access to healthcare.
It's very hard, isn't it? It's very, very, very painful to hear about that. And I think we're all very sorry to hear about what your father and your uncle are going through. Michela, as we draw this to a close, tell us a bit about what kind of reaction has your book had?
Well, it's been a tale of two halves. It's been very nice to see people whose opinions on Rwanda I mind in the West, you know, analysts, historians, journalists who know Rwanda well, responding very positively to it and welcoming back the message. And I got the sense almost that there was an element of the emperor has no clothes, that I'm the child that's been pointing to the emperor and saying, oh, but he has no clothes. And I'm getting a lot of messages through my website of people saying, yeah, I've been saying this for ages, you know, and nobody listened. And I thank God you're finally saying it in book form. So I think there's an element of that. On Twitter, which is where, you know, there's not been, I mean, Kagame made a very passing comment in Jeune Afrique during an interview where he said, well, you know, it's all these stupid things that are being said, and but everyone should read it if they, you know, read it for themselves and judge for themselves. So that was very, very uncharacteristically sober of him to say that. But I think the real response is what you see on Twitter, which is very, very actively used by the regime. And there's this the Rwanda Twitter army, and it's just a deluge of abuse. It's always, you know, it tends to be about me, never about the issues I raise, never the extermination program, the evidence that came out in the South African courts, the tape recordings of Rwandan officials who have been taped asking people in South Africa to assassinate key officials. None of that is ever discussed. All you get is ad hominem attacks. So I'm accused of having slept with my sources. I'm accused of being in the pay of the Ugandan Secret Service. I'm accused of having taken $300,000 from the Ugandans to write the book. I was working for the French military, for the French army back in 1994. It just goes on and on. It's just a pure tide of garbage, basically. And I think that tells you a great deal. I mean, it's the same as the story Veronica's been telling you, and also Eleneus, which is there is no tolerance of any kind of free speech in Rwanda. And it's also, for me, given how personalized the attacks have been, this idea that Rwanda is a wonderful place for women's rights, because people always say, oh, it's got more women in parliament than anyone else. It's such, I mean, you kind of go, yeah, that's a token gesture. I mean, if you look at the sheer misogyny and contempt for women in the tweets that are directed in my towards me, or any woman who dares to stand up and criticize the Rwandan government, tells you just how much that government believes in women's rights. But I think you can tell a lot from the kind of tweets that come out of Rwanda. It shows the ugly face of the regime, this very brutal, bullying face.
Very briefly, Eleneus, in a couple of words, how stable is the Rwandan government, do you think?
Well, I don't know. I think it's right at the ropes, because the moment you start fighting between yourselves as rats in a sack, then there is a possibility one time somebody is going to bite somebody so hard that something is going to happen. I think the problem here is you can see it among within the population, within the members of the public. And I know me as Eleneus can stand here or can sit here in the UK and say these things. I was a journalist there. I still follow issues there. But I also wanted to talk about I thought we could just maybe take a second or two to talk about some of the brave people that are actually now in Rwanda trying to use the means, any tools possible put out the message of what sort of dictatorship they are living under. And I talk here about specifically about people like Emebre Karasira, these YouTubers, that have the government having closed down all independent media. These people who have come up with other ways through YouTube channels to relay the message. The likes of Idamanje, the likes of Chuma, these people who have said things and ended up in jail. I know that the 3 people I've mentioned are now in jail. And people are beginning to speak up, because you can compress people to some extent. At some point, people are going to bust out, because for so long, for 27 years, people have been told you can't say this because we have to keep order. If we didn't do that, we might go back to, there's always this fear that if we don't do this, then we'll go back to the years of the genocide. But so much has gone on that people are so angry. Anything could happen right now.
That's very, very interesting, and that's very different from what we're normally hearing. And just very briefly, because we are out of time, Veronica, what's the one thing that you want people to take away from this about your father, in a sentence?
He's not the only one, and also be in alignment with what Eleneus has said about the people that are being really brave. And you can only imagine in Rwanda, where everything is dire. You say anything about supposedly the image of Rwanda, and it's just done. So yeah, it's getting tighter and tighter, and it looks like kind of doomish, like. So okay. I don't want to put it out there, but the more you stifle people who have been through quite some bit and haven't had the outlets to be able to speak or think freely, actually, because even that's an issue. Like, don't think, we'll think for you. That seems to be the RPF modus operandi. So yeah, people don't have lives at all. They're not in control of their lives. And it's just sad and sad and sad.
I think it is sad, and it's particularly sad when we remember a time of promise. Michela, just a sort of reflective thought at the end. Were we all duped? I mean, we were there during the genocide. We saw the horror of the genocide. We saw the RPF come in, and we did see them create a functioning state from that wreckage. Were we duped?
No, I mean, I think what I feel looking back is I didn't know enough about the context. I didn't know enough about what had happened in neighboring Burundi, for example, which had had a huge impact on making the atmosphere in Rwanda much more toxic. I also think none of us knew enough about what had happened between 1990 and 1994 in the northern part of Rwanda, where atrocities were committed by the RPF and have been coming to light now. But I also think, let's not forget that regimes change. And the reason why so many of these former senior RPF guys are now in exile denouncing Paul Kagame is because, you know, the regime has changed its nature. It's become, you know, a one-man show, as Eleneus was saying earlier. It's become much less tolerant of free speech. It's sort of given up on any idea of electoral accountability. I mean, there are a series of sort of very worrying landmarks that have been passed, very worrying events. And, you know, in my book, I sort of track them. So I think we gave those young men the benefit of the doubt because, you know, they were the people there. I mean, they were the sort of powers in the land, and they were saying all the right things. And the devastation was horrific. So someone was going to have to get that country back on its, you know, off its knees. But it has gone in a certain direction. And, you know, the trouble with countries that go off in this current direction is that they don't tend to sort of grind to a halt and then sort of go back towards moderation and tolerating free speech. They tend to just get more and more repressive and more tight, as Veronica was saying.
Eleneus, I know you want to speak, but we are over. We are over, and we all need to go and have a drink. So I'm going to cut you off in your prime. So I'm just going to end by saying, read the book. Michela sort of stole my last line, but I'm going to use it anyway, which is that there is actually a review of this book. And the review says, I don't need to read these idiocies. but I hope people read it and make up their own minds. And that review was by President Paul Kagame of Rwanda. So this is an occasion when I think we should do what President Kagame says. We should read it and make up our own minds. So thank you very much to Michela Wrong, Eleneus Akanga, and to Veronica Shandari Rusagara. And thank you all of you. And I'm sorry I didn't get to all of your questions, but I got to some of them. And I hope that you have found this evening enlightening, as I certainly have. Thank you very much and good night.